Welcome to the Beef Room. I'm Jenny Bradley. If you need anything, our speaker this section is Dr. Craig Payne. His official title is MU Director of Veterinary Extension, Columbia, Missouri. I've heard him several times, and every time I have learned something different. So let's get ready to listen to Craig. He's going to talk to us about emerging diseases in beef cattle.
Yeah, thank you. Just FYI, had a family emergency I had to deal with last night. Got about 1 to 2 hours of sleep, so everything's okay. I'm just a little bit dull-headed today, so keep that in mind as I try to talk. So I know that's really kind of a vague heading there. I didn't know what else to choose to describe what I was going to talk about. So let me kind of give you a list of items that we're going to try to get through this morning. I can't promise that we're going to get through them all, but this will at least give you a sense, and we'll go from there. So there's 3 diseases I want to talk about. The first one specifically that's what I would consider a truly emerging disease of beef cattle in the U.S. Now that's Theileria orientalis akita genotype. I know that's a mouthful for those of you that haven't seen that before, but that disease was first discovered in beef cattle in Virginia in 2017. It's been migrating westward ever since. Our first case here in Missouri was June of 2023, and I'll show you a map of where it's been diagnosed since then across the state or what counties it showed up in. And then we'll also talk about this disease. If any of you all know anything about anaplasmosis, it's very similar to presentation as anaplasm, but there's some challenges with this disease that I want you to be aware of. In fact, I visited with a veterinarian over in Marion County, which is a new county that's going to need to be added to the map yesterday, that is dealing with a producer that's got this going on right now. I'll probably tell some stories. So as far as I'm concerned, if we camp out on Theileria for a while, that's fine with me, because this in my mind is what is probably going to be the biggest impact in the state of any of these other things that we're going to talk about. Might talk a little bit about digital dermatitis, hairy heel boards. If any of y'all know anything about the dairy industry, they've been dealing with that disease for years. It's not emerging necessarily in that sector, but in beef cattle, it's starting to show up. Where it first started to show up was in the feedlot industry, and now I'm getting calls from producers and veterinarians across the state that are cow-calf operations that are dealing with this as well. Another frustrating disease, very difficult to get rid of once it gets introduced into an operation. This is a foot condition, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Also may get into H5N1. So bird flu in dairy cattle, if you're not aware, has become a big issue. And so a question I've been getting is, will we get bird flu into beef cattle and deal with some of the same challenges they have in the dairy industry? My speculation is no, but I'll explain that to you when we get there. Here's something else that came out this summer that I received a lot of questions about, and that was the university released an article back in August that implied that we were getting ready to release a vaccine for anaplasmosis that was being developed by a researcher. Unfortunately, that was not necessarily well written, and so we're a ways off from that vaccine being released, and I'll kind of give you a timeline.
A little premature?
Yeah, unfortunately. And then another thing I want to talk a little bit about, and this was just based upon questions that I received doing BQA certifications across the state this year. You know, there's been some hubbub on social media about mRNA vaccine use in livestock and post-COVID and all the concerns about mRNA vaccines there. There was a contingency that was talking about how the government was forcing livestock producers to use these vaccines in various livestock species. Truth of the matter is we don't currently have an mRNA vaccine approved for use in livestock, but we'll talk about what they're looking at least in that realm. And then, I don't know, we probably won't have any time left to talk much about this, but this isn't necessarily emerging. This is a question that I deal with every fall, it seems like. It's predominantly in fall calving herds. And it seems to me that we're seeing an increased rate of late-term reproductive losses, which would be abortion and stillbirths in these fall calving herds. I've got some data from the diagnostic lab. It's a little bit old. It just shows some of the diseases that are being diagnosed with abortions and stillbirths. We might also talk about heat stress and whether that contributes to fetal loss or not. Anyway, that's just kind of the menu that I have laid out for you. We'll try to get as far as we can into this until the bell goes off, and then we'll cut it off at that point. So, here we go, Tyleria orientalis Ikeda genotype. The reason why I keep saying this Ikeda genotype is that there are two other genotypes of Tyleria orientalis that have been in the U.S. for a while. They're not very pathogenic. They're Bufali and Katosi. When this one showed up in the U.S., there was a lot of concern because Asia, New Zealand, India, and other places like that have been dealing with this disease for a while, and it has variable pathogenicity. It's the most pathogenic of the orientalis types. So you'll hear me keep talking about Ikeda, and that's just to differentiate it from those other two. Right, so as I've already kind of indicated, the first case of Ikeda was diagnosed in a cow-calf herd in Virginia in 2017. They had about 7 animals die in that herd, age range of 3 months to 13 years. It was in August of that year. Because it presents very similar to anaplasmosis, that's just what they racked it up to being, was death loss associated with that disease. But they had some other animals die a month later, and through some further diagnostics is when they discovered that it was this Ikeda genotype that was causing this problem. And then since, it's been migrating westward, and here's some of the states where it has popped up in, with Arkansas really being the most recent after Missouri. In fact, I'm starting to get calls from veterinarians in Arkansas about how to manage this disease because it's new to them, and it's not like I'm an expert or anything, but they just don't have anybody else to turn to. And so they're calling their neighbors to the north, asking me what kind of experiences we're having with it here. So our first case here in this state was June 2023, Howell County, which you all know something about the state. That's the West Plains area. And then we've had about 19 total counties in which this disease has showed up since then. So here's the map of where it has been discovered at. And I think we can add Marion County to the list. So Howell County, Bates County, Platte County, Shelby County were kind of the first ones where it was diagnosed at. And this was added to what we call the reportable disease list here in Missouri in November of 2023. What that means is that a diagnostic lab that gets a sample submitted by a veterinarian or producer that comes up Tyleria positive, they report that to the state. The state does nothing other with that information than just say, we know it's in this location. There's no quarantine associated with this disease. That reportable is just so we can track where it's popping up at. And so that's why we know where these counties are where it has shown positive. So you can see that it kind of clusters here and a little bit here, but fairly wide distributed across the state. And here's the kicker. I think that as we go along, we're going to see the state become more and more purple, if that's the color they're using, simply because I think people have been mistaking it for anaplasm for a while. It's maybe been here a little bit longer than what we realized. That's why we went from 2 to 4 counties in 2023 to an additional 15 counties in 2024. Veterinarians are starting to realize that this is out there, and so if you look, you can get the find. Does that make sense? Any questions about this? I've been involved in this Bates County cases, Platte County. As I said, Marion County had a call from a veterinarian. This one right here, let me get to this slide and talk about kind of the disease, and I'll go back to that Callaway case here in just a moment. So, unlike anaplasmosis, which is a bacteria, this is a protozoa. why that's important is you will find out later is that this disease does not respond to any drugs that we have available here in the U.S. With anaplasmosis, we can use tetracycline like LA200, LA300 to treat it. If we have a clinical case, we can put chlorotetracycline in the feed to control the disease as well. We got no options with this one, so that's one thing that makes it very frustrating. So what happens is this protozoa infects red blood cells, the immune system recognizes those red blood cells as damaged, and so it eliminates those cells. That results in anemia, and the severity of the anemia dictates how severe the disease is. So just like you would see with anaplasmosis, which they get anemic as well, you can have anything from with a mild case of just like a elevated temperature, depression, off feed, and some pale mucous membranes. To the other end of the spectrum, you can see death loss. One characteristic is ventral edema. They can get yellowish tinge to their mucous membranes. Abortion with this disease in pregnant cows is more common than it is with anaplasmosis. But again, these are the very same signs that you will see with anaplasmosis minus that ventral edema or that fluid buildup in their chest, so to speak. Mortality rate in these herds where it has been discovered is typically fairly low. Now, I know 5% doesn't seem low, but it's better than it could be. You hear overseas, maybe, and this is because of production systems being a little bit different, of upwards of 30% death loss in those herds. Now, the Callaway case is a unique one in my experience here in Missouri. So, it was about a month ago, I received a call from a veterinarian in Callaway County, or works Callaway County. A producer had contacted him. This producer had 35 cows on a certain property. They wound up losing 12 of those cows. They were all third periods, and of those that were left standing, 8 of those cows aborted. So we had 12 deads and we had 8 abortions. About a $60,000 check was written back. And that was determined to be due to Theileria. Now, it's not normally that severe. The case that I worked with, or the veterinarian that I was visiting with that's working that Marion County case, they had a couple of cows. They were on their 3rd cow. They finally discovered what it was. They didn't respond to any treatment, so they've lost 3. I don't know how many total this producer had. That's more common than what that Callaway case would be. So we've already talked about, the late-term abortion thing. Here's one thing that's a little bit unique about this disease compared to anaplasmosis. With anaplasmosis, we typically don't see clinical signs in animals less than 2 years of age. With this one, you can see it anywhere from a calf all the way up to an old man. Now, I haven't heard of many, if any, calf cases in Missouri, but I'm telling veterinarians as I talk to them about this, if you have anaplasmosis-like symptoms showing up in calves, Theileria probably needs to move to the top of your list in this herd. Now, this one is pretty important to keep in mind and is kind of fascinating. Most animals that get this disease don't show clinical signs. Now, all of them will become chronic carriers of the organism. This is the same thing that happens with anaplasmosis, meaning that once an animal is infected, if they survive that infection, they're going to carry this organism for the rest of their life. The good side of that is that that animal will probably never ever show disease. The bad side to it is that animal represents a source of that organism that may be transmitted to other animals, and we'll talk about transmission methods here in just a minute. Now, here's why this is interesting in that by the time a producer sees Theileria in their herd or recognizes the first clinical case, most of the herd is probably already infected. Let me give you an example. In the Bates County case, this was a veterinarian's herd. He had some cows that had Tyleria, he decided to go in and do whole herd testing of those that were left. Of the 37 that he tested, 30 were already positive for Tyleria, 7 were negative. Okay, so that tells me that that disease has been circulating in that herd much longer. But the fact of the matter is that those animals didn't show clinical signs, or only a few did. Okay? All right, so here's some of the main differences between Tyleria and anaplasmosis clinical signs at any stage. As with anaplasmosis, is typically in animals older than 2 years. Late-term abortion is more common with Tyleria than it is with anaplasmosis. In anaplas cows, they get oxygen deprived, so do those with Tyleria, but for some reason, anaplas cows can become aggressive. Tyleria cows just remain very lethargic. They don't ever get to that aggressive phase. We don't know why that is. And there's just some other things that when I'm talking to veterinarians, I have them think about if they're going to be doing necropsies or exams on these animals. Okay, so transmission of this disease. A lot of insects have been implicated. We don't know what their importance is because they're not documented necessarily, but the Asian longhorn tick is the primary method by which this organism is spread from animal to animal. Asian longhorn tick's a new one in the U.S. as well. We have several counties in the state where that tick has been confirmed, but all those 19 counties positives that you saw for Tyleria doesn't necessarily have an identified Asian longhorn tick population in it or next to it. So why is that significant to me? Well, it could mean that we've got other modes of transmission out there, or those counties just haven't had Asian longhorn ticks diagnosed in them yet, but they're there. I don't know if that makes any sense to you all, but that's how my mind reconciles that. Because we've only had 4 counties in Missouri where Asian longhorn ticks have been identified. And that's Boone County. There's one over around, let's see, I think there's a county next to Shelby, down in South Missouri, and then somewhere over in the vicinity of Brookfield, there's been a population identified as well. That's the only 4 locations where the Asian longhorn tick. But we still have Tyleria all over the place, it seems like. Okay? Here's one that we talked about with that veterinarian yesterday, and that sucking lice have been associated with outbreaks of Tyleria. So those are just some of the insect vectors. Mechanical transmission, blood contaminated equipment. So if I get blood on a needle, if I'm vaccinating a positive cow, I can transfer that organism to a negative cow. I can also do that through tagging equipment if it's sufficiently contaminated with blood. And there's also some indication that we can have vertical transmission. So a calf being born to a cow that is chronically infected with this organism, about 10% of them seem to be infected themselves. That probably happens during the birthing process, not necessarily transplant transmission, but nonetheless, we can get some transmission that way. Treatment options, as I've already kind of alluded to, we don't have any drugs approved in the U.S. that will touch this thing. Some have tried injectable tetracycline like Oxytet, or LA200, LA300. Tried putting CTC in the feed, but with limited effectiveness. Now the Callaway case, and this case over in Marion County, you sometimes wonder if you've got a co-infection. We know the cases in Marion County had not only Tyleria, but also anaplasmosis together in these animals. My wondering in that Callaway case is maybe that was the same situation as to why it got a little bit out of hand. So as I'm talking to these veterinarians, I'm asking them, you know, is the client putting CTC in the feed? If not, maybe that's something to consider to maybe help eliminate loss, knowing that that's just going to be addressing anaplasmosis if it's there, and it's not really going to touch Tyleria. Does that make sense? Yeah. So the basic treatments that we have for this disease, just trying to minimize stress, limit handling, provide access to feed and water, and ride it out. You don't know how helpless you feel when you got a veterinarian that's had 12 big cows and 8 abortions asking if there's anything for treatment purposes, and you can say, we got nothing. You're just gonna have to ride the wave, and it'll eventually burn itself out. So, anyway, prevention or control, we don't have any antibiotics. Obviously, we don't have any vaccines available in the U.S. to control this disease. Control of ticks and lice populations is one method if the disease is already within a herd, and maybe keeping it a little bit isolated, changing needles between animals, as we've already talked about the reasons for that. And then for herds that are just hoping to keep it out for at least a while, you could consider, if you're purchasing animals, testing those before introducing them into the resident population. But that test ain't cheap. It's $39 a head. And so here's where I think we're going with this. I'll back up to this slide. I think we'll do the best that we can, and this is what other states have experienced. We'll do the best that we can with the initial wave of Theileria that's going through Missouri. Once this disease becomes established within our cattle populations, we will have just this endemic stability, and we'll see the clinical cases just kind of be, it won't be these bad outbreaks, it will just kind of be something that we deal with very much like we deal with anaplasmosis. How long that's going to take, the places like Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee that's been working through this, they say that initial insult takes about a year or 2, maybe 3 to get through, and then everything just kind of simmers down. Try as you might to keep this out of your herd. If you're a closed herd, you got probably a better chance than if you're buying cattle. But at the same rate, I hate to be this way, but if this is going to get endemic like anaplasmosis, maybe there's a point where we just need to bite the bullet, let it get into our herds, get established, get these chronic carrier states so we don't have these bad disease outbreaks associated with this. Because again, we got no vaccines, we got no antibiotics, so I'm really, as an extension veterinarian, I'm put in kind of a weird position because I really don't know the best advice to give to people because we really don't have it at this point. So I know that gives you a lot of comfort. So, any questions? I don't want to leave you empty, which I probably have, not giving you much to go off of other than this can be kind of a mess.
Do you think it's been in this state longer than what you're saying it's been longer?
Yeah, I think we probably.
It looks that much like anaplasmosis. It sounds to me like a lot of cases that have been attributed, like you said. It sounds to me like we've had it for a while, longer than 23.
Yeah, I would probably speculate Dr. Collins can throw
It's very well, because me and him were from Cal, we never even heard about this guy.
Yeah.
So.
I would say it probably has been here since at least 2022. Maybe even sooner. And it just takes, so for those of you that have gone through bacillary hemoglobinuria in this part of the state, or red water, where it blew up several years ago, in talking with veterinarians around here, they have been seeing cases, now that we know what it was, they have been describing cases that they have been seeing in dead cattle in the field that had, when they're doing necropsies, that were bacillary hemoglobinuria a year before we even knew what it was. And so the way these new diseases kind of work is they fly under the radar for a while, and then finally when you realize what's going on, you're already down the track quite a ways. Now people realize it, and you start finding it everywhere, but it's been there for a year or 2. So that's kind of the way this is behaving, would be my assumption.
How long does it last in a herd before it sort of burns itself out?
Yeah, it's gonna depend upon how fast the population itself becomes chronically infected. So, you know, if you had a massive transmission, whether that was through ticks or a lice infestation, you're probably going to have, I'm going to this Callaway incident, because this was, I won't give you the history of this herd, but they came from elsewhere other than Missouri. And I think what happened is they got exposed. They were naive to anaplasma and naive to Theileria. They got exposed, and that's why it blew up so bad. Whereas you've got these other herds where it's probably just kind of been trickling through it for a while, and cows have just gradually been becoming positive over time as it's being transmitted through ticks and needles or whatever. And it's a slower build to herd stability than just, we're gonna take a naive herd, we're just gonna infect all of them, and it's just gonna be a train wreck. So I don't have an answer to your question. I would say that herd that it was a one and done, they're good to go. For these herds that it's just having to gradually get established in, they're probably gonna have 1s and 2s and 3s every year, but it's not gonna be this big blow up like the herd that was just naive and all of a sudden. I'm just playing off other diseases and how they yeah. Keep in tune, it'll be interesting to watch this play out. Okay, so let me ask you this. What time are we?
10:26.
Any of these here that you want to put before another? Let's talk about that anaplasmosis vaccine here real quick, since we're kind of in the anaplasm mindset. All right, here's the article that came out, that says August 28, 2024. And so, Mizzou researchers developed first ever vaccine for bovine anaplasmosis. Here's a couple of issues that I have with this story. First of all, this vaccine has been developed primarily, most of the work has been done at K-State. What happened is that the individual that has been leading this research project was hired away from K-State and has been at MU since 2023. But all the cattle and all the vaccine research up to this point in time has been done at K-State. The first story of this vaccine being in development came out in about 2022, I believe it was. And it created a lot of interest simply because anaplasmosis is kind of rough. This isn't published data. That's why I want to hook up my computer. I hope I have this. Okay, this isn't published data because she hasn't submitted it yet. But faculty members at our diagnostic lab have been looking at the prevalence of anaplasmosis in the state. And the findings here do not surprise me, but this survey that's been conducted by Dr. Iarde, she's got samples from 59 herds in 34 counties across the state. And 55 of those 59 herds have had at least one positive animal, which does not surprise me, it's endemic in Missouri. And of the total 907 cattle tested across these 59 herds, 46 were chronic carriers. Right, so we've got a university herd, I won't tell you where it's at, but we went through and did whole herd testing several years ago, and 75% of that herd was positive for anaplasmosis. And so I think on average, we're probably looking at a lot of herds in the state already have anaplasmosis in it. And that's why we occasionally see blow-ups, and it's a devastating, it can be an economically devastating disease. And so there has been a lot of interest in vaccines. There used to be an old vaccine called Plasvax that I graduated in '93 and I had an opportunity to use that a little bit to get some unintended consequences associated with that vaccine, and so it was pulled from the marketplace. And that, the only vaccine that we've had available since then is what they call a conditionally licensed vaccine, and that means that it doesn't have any data behind it to say that it's effective. Veterinarians have been using it, but I get different stories as to how effective it is. And so when it came to this vaccine being advertised or described, and the technology that was using and how promising it could be, you can imagine how much excitement there was over this. So the morning this article came out, my phone started ringing off the wall from veterinarians across the state saying, I got clients already calling me asking, when can we get our orders in? Because we want to get this going. And so I contacted the researcher which this article was written about, and I said, all right, give me the lowdown. How long is it going to be before this is available? He said, at minimum, if everything goes well, 5 years. So don't hold your breath on this vaccine, at least for the next 5 years. It's still in the very infancy of the testing of it. It does look very promising. It's kind of a unique approach at how it works, in that what it's actually doing, to my understanding, or in some of the papers published about it, it is actually establishing a chronic carrier state in an animal, because that chronic carrier state is protected. Meaning it's going to infect the animal with anaplasmosis. It's going to be, the organism is not going to be able to over-replicate, so it won't cause clinical disease, but it will establish that chronic carrier state. And that chronic carrier state in and of itself will be a protective effect, because the animal just has continual immunity because of that chronic infection. So it's a novel approach, but we're 5 years away from seeing it happen, at least. So sorry about that. We already kind of let the cat out of the bag on the mRNA vaccine use in cattle. Right now, there is no vaccines approved in the U.S. for any livestock. But just FYI, there's a lot of active research in this area because of some of the attributes of these mRNA vaccines and how quick they can bring them to market. And so they're looking at developing mRNA vaccines for bovine respiratory disease or controlling pneumonia, for avian influenza in dairy cattle, or H5N1 in dairy cattle, foot and mouth disease. I mean, there's so many different types of foot and mouth disease viruses out there that if you don't have the certain type, if you have a foot and mouth disease outbreak, you gotta go get the right type, because it needs to be the same type as the one that's causing the outbreak if you want to get protection with the vaccine. Is a simple way I can describe it. And so with an mRNA vaccine, because of the ability they have to bring that online so quick, it's become an area of interest in terms of vaccine development for foot and mouth disease if we ever need it in a place like the U.S. The challenge is where we're at right now with these mRNAs. We're probably about 2, if not 5 years away from them coming to market, because they're not cost effective in their current form from experts that I've listened to, mainly because of the cost of the raw materials. And the fact that my vet box can't store vaccines at -80°F or in your cooler chute side, that's another limitation, right? It's the cold storage. And so until they get it figured out of how to make these a little bit more user-friendly, we're probably not going to see them to any great extent used in livestock. Let's back up and talk about this H5N1 deal. And getting the questions about will it become problematic. How many of you in here know anything about this H5N1? No. So let's talk a little bit on the background why it's caused such a hubbub. So here's kind of the history on this influenza outbreak in cattle. So an unknown illness was first reported in the Texas Panhandle at a dairy operation in February of this year. And this right here was what they were seeing in these dairy calves. Really high fever. Here's what was unusual, other than the high fever, is that these were cows that were a little bit older, mid to late lactation, and their milk didn't look like milk, instead it looked like colostrum. And so it had a low percent of the cattle affected, but it led to the majority of those cattle being culled. And veterinarians were speculating that this may just be a different presentation of some other diseases that were fairly common, but they continued to dig. And what they found out is that this was an H5N1 virus that was causing this problem. Now, here's why that was unique. And that was the first time worldwide that this avian influenza virus had ever been detected in cattle. I'll get to another slide here in a little bit. But what they think happened is that there was an initial spillover event from waterfowl. So this virus came from Asia, Europe, and it got here through transatlantic waterfowl migration or migratory pathways. It's been in North and South America for several years, but maybe because of the amount of virus that's in North and South America, because this virus has become adapted to waterfowl, has gotten so high that we just finally had an animal get exposed. Now, we don't know how that exposure happened. I don't think this was a duck and a cow having a moment together. But nobody can really give us an idea how it happened. But that spillover event is what created the initial case. That got spread within the operation, and then all the spread of this across the U.S. since then has been through just dairy cattle movement. So I didn't know this, but evidently dairy cattle get moved a lot, a long distance, and so you had all these dairy cows that had become infected in the Texas Panhandle, their heifers getting moved, and that was what was spreading it across the rest of the United States. Okay, so here's why this was so unique, and that is that this was the first case that we had of H5N1 reported in cattle. We do have historic evidence that from poultry to humans, we've seen this virus be passed in the past and transmitted in the past. Those cases are respiratory in human, and over half of them have been fatal. Not a lot of them, but half of them were fatal. Because this was the first infection in cattle, we didn't know what the consequences of this virus being in cattle on human health was going to be. And so people got really concerned about this being transmitted through raw milk and how that was going to impact the human population, if it could be aerosolized and people could get respiratory disease. So far, all that we have seen is just some of these dairy workers have gotten conjunctivitis and have had a mild respiratory disease, but for the most part, it hasn't been as bad as maybe what some were anticipating. Okay, so with that, will this disease become a problem in beef cattle? And is this something that we're going to have to deal with like they are in the dairy cattle operations? And they're still fighting this, and it's going to continue to be an issue for them for at least a while. So the main way that this is being transmitted from animal to animal is not through aerosolization, like nose-to-nose contact. This virus has a predilection for a cell type that exists in the udder of these dairy cows, or cattle in general. And so this virus likes to replicate in the udder, and so the milk coming from these cows has a lot of virus in it. And so as that virus contaminates milking equipment, maybe gets splashed around, that's how it's getting transmitted from cow to cow. What we think is happening is it's climbing up the teat canal of a cow that's not infected, if they're coming into with contaminated milkers, and it's transmitting that way. Okay, why is that important from a beef cattle standpoint, knowing that? Because if it does get into a beef cattle herd, it's going to be self-limiting, because we're not milking beef cattle. Maybe their calf might get exposed to it through nursing, but I mean, that calf doesn't have an udder developed at that time. We don't know of it causing any type of digestive upsets in cattle to a great extent. So really, it's going to be kind of a dead end if it does get into the cattle population. Now, why is that important? Well, it's because that's just one less thing we have to worry about the public criticizing the beef industry about, is beef coming from cows that have H5N1, or at least beef cows. Now, there has been some meat samples that were collected from culled dairy cows that were infected have been H5N1 positive. The great thing about this virus is it's very susceptible to heat, so pasteurization of milk and cooking of meat wipes it out instantaneously. But you're starting to see, well, I saw a news article last night about USDA upping the amount of milk that's being tested from these dairy operations. But from my opinion, in the beef cattle side of the equation, this is not something that we're going to have to really worry about. All right. Anything else you want to talk about? Where we at? I know those topics may not be of tremendous interest to you, at least these.
Why are we seeing more problems with hooves on cattle now?
Okay. So a little bit on this Harry Hill work outfit. Here's your typical foot rot. And this is caused by this bacteria, rapid onset. Most of y'all have dealt with foot rot. Okay? You get this symmetrical swelling of that hoof. If y'all have ever picked up a hoof with foot rot, you've noticed in between the claws that skin can be split open. Sometimes you might catch a whiff of some kind of necrotic tissue. Here's the good thing about foot rot, if there is a good thing, and that it typically responds, if you're treating early in the process, it responds well to things like oxytetracycline. This digital dermatitis or hairy heel wart, that's just one picture, and I'll show you some more. This is caused by a treponema species, and there's several species of this that can cause this disease. Here's the challenge with these species. One is they are very good at establishing chronic infections. So there's a treponema species that causes syphilis. And so this is the treponemas that are causing this condition in cattle feet, or in that same family, right, or that same species. So these organisms are very fastidious. They can survive in the environment for quite a while, but they're also motile. They got the ability to migrate down into the skin tissue once they invade it. And so the problem is that if you try to treat these digital dermatitis or these hairy heel warts with an injectable antibiotic, the bacteria is not deep enough in the tissue to have much of a good blood supply for the antibiotic to be carried to it to kill it. And it's deep enough that even though topical treatments with tetracycline, squirt stuff on their hoof is the ideal treatment, a lot of these treponemes, that by the time we discover there's a problem, they're so deep in the tissue that you can't get it from the surface. So you find yourself between a rock and a hard place with these organisms. They're deep enough that you can't get them topically, but they're not deep enough. They're not so deep that you can get them with an injectable antibiotic. And now you develop these chronic infections in these cattle, and it gets spread within these herds. And so here's just kind of the progression of this disease, and this is why it's so aggravating for cattle feeders when they're dealing with this in feedlots. And that is, it can take up to 140 days for cattle to exhibit clinical signs associated with this disease. And so if you think about these cattle coming off these trucks into these feed yards that are just dealing with this day and night, How many days on feed are cattle spending at this day and age? 180, 150? By the time these cattle are getting close to being finished, now they're starting to see digital dermatitis in these cattle, and it's really knocking these cattle for a loop because they're towards the end of finish, and now these veterinarians are trying to figure out how to manage it. When it gets into these cow-calf herds, obviously we don't have that concern. When it gets chronically established in cows, replacement heifers, and in the dairy world, what they do is they run these cattle through foot baths continuously trying to manage this disease. That's what they're doing in the feedlots right now. These cattle are coming off trucks that are having, these yards that are having issues with this. There's been a couple operations I've spoken with here in Missouri that confined cattle feed. They'll run these cattle off the truck through a foot bath, trying to knock it down. If they're carrying something into the yard, if they have a pen break, they'll run these cattle through a foot bath. They may run them through a foot bath if they're gonna re-implant. So foot baths are becoming a common practice in these feed yards, just like it has been in the dairy industry for years. What we're running into in these cow-calf operations where it's getting established as well, I know we're dealing with pasture cattle, and running them through a foot bath is not quite as simple as what it is with the confinement system, but these producers are getting to the point where they're getting far enough down the path with some of these cases that you'll find these cow-calf producers starting to use foot baths as well. Because you can try to treat animals individually, as you can imagine if these cattle are out in pasture, how difficult that would be monitored. So really, here's what happens is whether it's foot rot, folks, whether it's digital dermatitis, this is an issue associated with hoof hygiene. So if that skin that surrounds that hoof is constantly immersed in water, standing in ponds, mud, being damaged by corn stubble, you'll hear some people talk about cattle being handled roughly. If they're on a surface where they can get good grip and they can pivot, that will cause micro tears in the tissue. So in some yards, they're talking about one way we help manage this is get our crews to handle these cattle a little bit more calmly and quietly. But anything that damages that tissue allows that organism to become established, and because it's a motile organism, it will just start burying its way down through that tissue in the hoof, and the deeper it goes, the more damage it occurs. So by the time most people pick up these lesions, these cattle are already somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 months past the initial infection. You don't see lameness with these early lesions. Okay, so about 3 to 6 weeks after infection, you may see something, if you're really paying attention, you may see a little damage spot showing up on the back of the hoof, but this doesn't show lameness, so most people miss these, and by the time they do see lameness, we're 3 or 4 months down the road, this bacteria is already deep within the tissues, and now we're starting to get ourselves in trouble. And so when you treat these things, you do get a little scab formation, but by the time that scab forms off, what you wind up with is this chronic condition, and sometimes you'll have these new lesions form on top of the old lesions, and you start the process all over again. So these cows wind up not only shedding pathogen and contaminants into the environment, affecting other cattle, but they themselves become a cull candidate because it's just chronically lame. Now, not all cattle become chronically lame associated with this disease, but it does, for some of them, it just becomes a cyclical problem. Yes, sir.
How long does it take for this organism to die out in the environment, or is that something?
Yeah, 6 to 8 weeks is what you'll typically read. And so, if we're talking about a feed yard pen, how many yards can leave a pen open for 6 to 8 weeks? Now, obviously, if it's in sun and it's dry, that's going to help speed it along the amount of time. If they scrape the pen, scrape the aprons, make sure they kind of clean it up, that will help reduce that time. I think maybe that's why we're having some challenges in some of these cow-calf operations. is that you get these cattle congregating in the woods or around ponds and stuff like this, and just kind of like the foot rot organism that can become kind of ubiquitous, so does this organism. Unfortunately, it's unresponsive. So,
One other question, does this disease or any of the diseases we're talking about affect other things like sheep, goats, and
Yeah.
outdoor pigs?
great question. So the Tyleria, sheep can be asymptomatic carriers of it, but they won't show clinical symptoms. Tanya, do you know anything about treponines and small ruminants, if they impact?
I don't
I
know.
know they can have foot rot, for a month of Sundays, but, the rest of these I'm not. H5N1, there's a swine version that is problematic. I'm not hearing, there was a H5N1 case in a goat even before it was recognized in dairy cattle. That was a spillover event from a backyard poultry flock that this operation had. Some of the goats they had on that same operation contracted that virus from the birds. So, but for the rest of it, I think those are about the main cross species effects. So, thanks for sticking with me. I know that was just kind of all over the board. I hope I gave you something that, hope I didn't depress you too much with all these chronic diseases that we described, but
Got one other quick
Yeah.
question, do you have any updates on the Red River?
The red water.
What red water
Yeah.
thing?
it's,
That part of it.
so I think that, as people have become aware of it, we have seen a decreased number of cases being submitted to the diagnostic lab, but we still have flare-ups. I think we're, probably seeing some of those is in herds that can only vaccinate once a year, we'll have some cases. Because unfortunately that Clostridium hemolyticum component of an 8-way blackleg vaccine only has about a 6-month duration of immunity. And so for operations that can't vaccinate twice a year, they're possibly leaving themselves open for a period of time. That's an issue. But compared to what it was 5 years ago when it first broke, it's minimal in the grand scheme of things. So I applaud the veterinarians, producers up in this area for getting on top of that. Because it was, when we didn't know what it was, and even in the early stages when we did, knocking lots of money.
So the liver flukes themselves aren't really what kills the cows too much, it's mainly the lack of that.
The liver fluke set them up. Yeah. Clostridium takes them down. As I talked about the liver fluke thing up here a couple of years ago, those things are so, the deer flukes especially, which is what we got up here, just a fluke control in and of itself because of the timing and the lack of great products that we have as a challenge. So always, fluke control's okay, but with bacillary hemoglobin or red water, that vaccine component becomes critical.
Thank you, Dr. Payne.
Better get Dr. Bailey up here so he can salvage the morning after me.
Like that,